They threatened to demolish my family home while standing on land they didn't know I owned, the beginning of a war that would destroy their lives forever. "Mr. Foster, your IOR is ruining our $1,000,000 view," Victoria Harrington screamed, diamond ring flashing under the Montana sun. Little did this HOA tyrant realize she was trespassing on my property while threatening me. She had no idea I legally owned the lake and their fancy brochures and the parking lot where their luxury SUVs sat. Their resort dreams would soon shatter, spectacularly, when they messed with the wrong wildlife biologist. I see viewers from all over watching this HOA nightmare. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and if you've ever faced off with power-hungry HOAs like these. The day had started peacefully enough. After 3 years of tracking endangered species across South America, I had finally returned to my grandfather's cabin at Osprey Lake to write my book and decompress. The property had been in our family for generations, and when Grandpa James passed away 3 years ago, he left it to me, along with a mysterious wooden chest full of old journals and maps. I'd spent the morning setting up my observation equipment along the shoreline, thrilled to discover a nesting pair of mountain phoenix, a bird species so rare many believed it extinct. Their copper and gold feathers gleamed in the morning light, a wildlife biologist's dream come true. Then came the rumble of luxury SUVs and the crunch of designer heels on gravel. 5 women marched up my dirt path, led by Victoria Harrington, whose face was frozen in a permanently disgusted expression, as though the very air around my cabin might contaminate her Chanel suit. "This is a formal notice from Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, thrusting a pink paper into my hands. "Your property violates numerous community aesthetic standards and must be brought into compliance within 30 days. I stared at the paper, then back at her, completely baffled. Homeowners Association? My family had owned this land decades before any development existed around the lake. "There must be some mistake," I said, trying to maintain my composure despite the absurdity of the situation. "This property isn't part of any HOA. My grandfather built this cabin in the 1960s, long before—" Victoria cut me off with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "The HOA boundaries were redrawn 5 years ago. Your dwelling falls within our jurisdiction now. We have the maps to prove it." She snapped her fingers, and a tall man with a fake tan and unnaturally white teeth stepped forward, holding an official-looking document. "My husband Maxwell," she said, unnecessarily. Maxwell didn't offer to shake hands. Instead, he started filming with his phone, narrating as though documenting wildlife, which, in this case, was apparently me. "As you can see, followers, we've discovered a prime example of property devaluation in its natural habitat," Maxwell said to his phone, panning across my cabin. "This eyesore is hurting home values by at least 20%, but don't worry, we'll be documenting its amazing transformation." I felt my face grow hot as I noticed the other women snapping pictures of my research equipment, bird feeders, and specimen collection boxes, whispering, "disgusting," and "primitive," just loud enough for me to hear. Victoria handed me a thick binder, labeled Evergreen Estates Aesthetic Guidelines, and pointed toward the weathered dock where my kayak rested. "Your access to the lake is also in violation. All watercraft must be approved and stored in the community boathouse." When I protested, explaining this was private property and the dock had existed for half a century, Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Foster, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your grandfather may have been eccentric, but times have changed. Osprey Lake is evolving into an exclusive resort community, and your little science experiment doesn't fit our vision. You have 30 days to bring the property up to standards or face legal consequences." As they turned to leave, I noticed Maxwell filming one more sweeping shot of the shoreline where the birds had nested. Victoria paused, looking back with what almost seemed like pity. "Oh, and those binoculars and cameras? Wildlife stalking violates community guidelines. Birdwatching requires a permit and HOA approval." After they left, I stood dumbfounded on my porch, violation notice crumpled in my hand. I had returned seeking peace and connection with my grandfather's legacy, only to find myself in the crosshairs of what appeared to be the most entitled HOA in existence. As the sun set over the lake, casting golden ripples across the water, I noticed one of the phoenix birds return to its nest, its vigilant eyes surveying the territory it considered home. "I know exactly how you feel," I muttered, heading inside to dig through my grandfather's papers. There, at the bottom of his old toolbox, I found a yellowed note in his handwriting: "When the birds return, open the safe." I had no idea what safe he meant, but something told me I needed to find it, and fast. The search for Grandpa's mysterious safe consumed my entire night. I tapped walls, lifted floorboards, and checked behind every picture frame in the cabin. Finally, at 3 in the morning, exhausted and dusty, I noticed something odd about the old stone hearth. One of the rocks had a nearly invisible seam around it. With trembling fingers, I pressed and twisted, and the stone moved, revealing a small compartment containing an ancient combination safe. The combination wasn't hard to guess: my birthday. Typical Grandpa, sentimental to the core. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, detailed maps of Osprey Lake, land surveys, property deeds, and most interestingly, decades of scientific journals documenting the mountain phoenix population. My grandfather, it seemed, hadn't just been a quirky old man who loved fishing. He'd been a serious ornithologist who had discovered the rare birds in the 1970s and kept their existence secret to protect them. The journals detailed their nesting habits, migration patterns, and most critically their endangered status. But nestled among the scientific papers was something else: legal documents showing that while my grandfather had sold parcels of land around the lake for development, he had explicitly retained ownership of the lake itself and a large tract of land currently being used as the HOA's main parking lot. I was still processing this information when a knock at my door startled me. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. I'd been reading all night. Standing on my porch was a woman about my age, with dark curly hair and an expression that suggested both curiosity and amusement. "Hi, I'm Maya Santiago," she said, extending her hand. "I just moved into one of those monstrosities across the lake. I think we might be the only 2 people under 50 in this entire community." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "I saw the HOA welcome wagon descend on you yesterday. Victoria's quite something, isn't she?" Over coffee on the porch, I learned Maya was an environmental lawyer who had bought her house for the advertised natural wilderness experience, only to discover the HOA's aggressive landscaping rules prohibited even native plant species in yards. "Everything has to be perfectly manicured," she explained, rolling her eyes. "I spent $6,000 on natural xeriscaping and they made me tear it out for Kentucky bluegrass in Montana. Do you know how much water that wastes?" As we talked, I noticed her gaze lingering on my bird observation equipment. When I explained my work studying endangered species, her eyes lit up. "So you're not just some random hermit," she laughed, though the beard was throwing me off. I found myself showing Maya my grandfather's journals and the legal documents I'd discovered. As she flipped through them, her expression grew increasingly serious. "Liam, these aren't just interesting historical artifacts. If your grandfather really maintained ownership of the lake and that parking lot, and if there's an endangered species nesting here, this could be significant." She was about to elaborate when the rumble of heavy machinery interrupted us. Looking toward the shoreline, we saw a construction crew with excavation equipment heading to the edge of the lake. Leading them was Victoria, blueprints in hand, with Maxwell filming the entire procession. "What the hell?" I muttered, grabbing my binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see the crew setting up barriers around a section of natural shoreline, the exact area where I'd spotted the phoenix nests. Victoria was gesturing emphatically, pointing at different areas while Maxwell nodded enthusiastically. "I need to stop them," I said, already heading down the path. Maya followed, phone in hand. "Wait," she said, "let me document this. If they're disturbing protected habitat, we'll need evidence." As we approached, the hostility from Victoria was palpable. She stood straighter, crossing her arms as if creating a physical barrier between us and the construction site. "Mr. Foster," she said coolly, "this is a private HOA improvement project, members only." I pointed to the stakes marking the construction boundaries, which extended well into what I now knew was my property. "Actually, according to the original land deeds, this shoreline belongs to me. You're trespassing." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows shot up and she exchanged glances with Maxwell. For the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered across her face, but she quickly recovered. "Our records indicate otherwise. This shore beautification project has been approved by the board and will commence today." She gestured to the crew to continue. Maxwell stepped forward, phone still recording. "This will make amazing content for our followers," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Local hermit opposes community improvements. Perhaps we should include your interesting fashion choices in our before section." I felt my temper rising, but Maya put a restraining hand on my arm. "May we see the permits for this work?" she asked pleasantly. "Shoreline modification typically requires approval from the State Environmental Protection Division, especially in areas with documented wildlife habitats." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "And you are?" Maya Santiago, environmental attorney, Maya replied, extending her business card. Victoria took it between two fingers, as if it might contaminate her. Well, Ms. Santiago, all necessary permissions have been obtained. We're converting this unsightly natural shoreline into a beautiful sand beach for our residents. The permits are on file at the HOA office. She turned to me, her voice hardening. And this matter doesn't concern you, Mr. Foster. Focus on bringing your property up to code before your 30 days expire. As we watched, helpless for the moment, the workers began clearing vegetation from the shoreline. I noticed with alarm that they were working perilously close to one of the phoenix nests. Maya quietly took photos, whispering, "Don't worry, we'll stop this, but we need to be strategic." Walking back to the cabin, I felt a strange mix of anger and determination forming in my gut. "I need to talk to someone who knew my grandfather," I said. "These papers suggest he had a plan, but I'm missing something." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "The documents mention someone named Walter Reed, a retired judge? Maybe he knows something." As we reached the cabin, I found another pink violation notice taped to my door: unauthorized scientific activities and improper vehicle parking. The battle lines were being drawn, and I realized this wasn't just about a shabby cabin anymore. It was about protecting my grandfather's legacy and the rare creatures he'd dedicated his life to studying. Walter Reed lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by native wildflowers and bird feeders, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of evergreen estates. At 75, he retained the sharp eyes and deliberate speech patterns of the judge he'd once been, though his outfit of worn jeans and a fly-fishing vest suggested he'd happily left that life behind. When I mentioned my grandfather's name, his weathered face broke into a wide smile. "James Foster's grandson? Well, I'll be damned. Come in, son, we've got a lot to talk about." His living room walls were covered with fishing photos, many featuring him and my grandfather standing proudly beside the lake, decades younger but with the same mischievous smiles. "Your grandfather was the smartest man I ever knew," Walter said, pouring 3 fingers of whiskey into glasses despite the early hour. "Not just book smart, though he was that too, but wood smart. He understood that the land around Osprey Lake was going to change, that development was inevitable, so he got ahead of it." Walter explained that in the 1980s, when developers first came knocking, my grandfather had sold parcels strategically, but with careful restrictions. Made them think they were getting everything, but James kept the heart. The lake itself and that big parcel they're now using as a parking lot had it all written up airtight. Walter chuckled. The agreement allowed them use of that land for 30 years, which, by my calculation, expires in about 3 months. Maya leaned forward. "But how could they not know? Surely there are records of this arrangement." Walter nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey. "There are, but development companies change hands. The original developers went bankrupt in the 2000s, and the new owners probably never bothered to check the fine print. Then when this fancy HOA formed, they just assumed they owned everything. James always said they wouldn't know until it was too late." He set down his glass and fixed me with a serious look. "But here's what matters now. James discovered those phoenix birds back in 73, kept it quiet to protect them. He knew if word got out, either poachers or tourists would destroy their habitat." Walter pulled out an old leather briefcase and removed a file. "James left this with me in case things went south after he was gone. It's the complete record of the phoenix population, their protected status under federal law, and maps of their nesting areas." He pushed it across the table. "He wanted to make sure you'd have ammunition if anyone ever threatened the lake." I felt a lump in my throat. My grandfather had planned for this moment, had somehow known I would need these exact documents. Why didn't he just tell me all this before he died? Walter smiled sadly. "James believed some knowledge is only valuable when you discover it at the right time. He wanted you to find your own connection to this place, not just inherit his battles." Armed with Walter's file and my grandfather's documents, Maya and I formulated a plan. First, we needed official confirmation of the land ownership, which meant a trip to the county records office. Second, we needed to document the phoenix habitat and file for emergency protected status. And third, though this was Maya's suggestion more than mine, we needed to gather intelligence on Victoria's true motive. "This isn't just about aesthetic standards," Maya insisted. "Nobody gets this worked up about a cabin unless there's money involved." Before leaving Walter's, I asked about Victoria and Maxwell Harrington. His expression darkened. "Newcomers. She used to run some big cosmetics company until a scandal about false advertising forced her out. Now they're trying to rebuild their image as luxury lifestyle influencers or some such nonsense. Word is they've been courting investors for a major development project. We were heading back to the cabin when Maya's phone buzzed with a notification. "You've got to see this," she said, her voice tight with anger. Maxwell had posted a video online, heavily edited to make me appear unhinged, ranting about property rights while wearing what he called my Unabomber chic outfit. The caption read, "Local science hermit opposes community progress and beautification." Comments were flooding in, most mocking my appearance or suggesting I should be grateful the HOA was improving my squalid surroundings. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. "They're trying to turn the community against you before you can make your case," Maya observed. "Classic strategy, discredit the opposition." Back at the cabin, I found my internet connection suddenly spotty, then completely dead. A call to the service provider confirmed someone had reported my line as abandoned and requested disconnection. When I drove to the main road to check my mail, I discovered my access path had been blocked by a newly installed gate marked Evergreen Estates Private Property. The gate attendant, an apologetic older man named Frank, shrugged helplessly. "New HOA directive. I need to see a resident pass or guest authorization." When I explained I lived in the cabin, he looked confused. "That old place?" Ms. Harrington said it was abandoned and scheduled for demolition. The situation escalated further when I returned to find a notice of emergency environmental inspection taped to my door, scheduled for the following morning. Through my binoculars, I could see workers had already cleared a significant portion of the shoreline vegetation, dangerously close to the phoenix nesting area. One nest appeared damaged or possibly destroyed. Anger and desperation welled up inside me. I was being systematically cut off, discredited, and obstructed. And worse, the birds my grandfather had protected for decades were in immediate danger. That night, under cover of darkness, Maya helped me set up wildlife cameras around the remaining nests. "We need to document everything," she insisted. "The law is on our side, but we need incontrovertible evidence." Walter called with news. He'd spoken with an old colleague at the Environmental Protection Division, who agreed to issue an emergency stop work order for the shoreline project, effective immediately. "It buys us a little time," Walter said. "But Victoria has connections. She'll fight this." I thanked him, feeling a small measure of hope for the first time in days. As if the universe were acknowledging this moment, I spotted the male phoenix returning to one of the intact nests, its copper wings catching the moonlight. I carefully documented its return, adding to the evidence file we were building. Maya watched silently beside me, then finally spoke. "You know, for what it's worth, I bought my house because the brochure promised untouched wilderness and rare wildlife viewing opportunities. Seems like Victoria's development plans contradict her own marketing materials." She smiled wryly. "Might be worth mentioning at the next HOA meeting, which, by the way, is tomorrow night. Want to crash it with me?" The Evergreen Estates clubhouse looked like it had been plucked from a golf course in Beverly Hills and dropped incongruously into the Montana wilderness. All white columns and manicured hedges, with valets parking residents' luxury vehicles. Maya and I arrived intentionally late, slipping into the back of a meeting room filled with about 50 residents. Victoria stood at a podium, projecting images of what she called the Lake Beautification Initiative, renderings, showing the natural shoreline replaced with sand beaches, floating docks, and what appeared to be a cocktail bar built over the water. "Phase 1 is already underway," she announced proudly, "though we've encountered a temporary delay due to frivolous environmental complaints." Maxwell worked the crowd, filming reactions and encouraging attendees to share their excitement for social media. Victoria continued, her voice taking on a concerned tone. "Unfortunately, we've also encountered resistance from the occupant of the old cabin property." My photo, clearly taken without my knowledge or consent, appeared on the screen. Several residents turned to stare at me. "Mr. Foster has made unreasonable claims about property ownership and is harboring unregistered wildlife on his property. The board is taking appropriate legal action, but in the meantime, please avoid engaging with him for your own safety." I felt a surge of anger at the blatant mischaracterization, but Maya squeezed my arm, whispering, "Wait for the right moment." That moment came during the Q&A session, when a silver-haired man named Richard Clark, introduced as the HOA's landscape architect, began describing how the eyesore cabin would eventually be replaced with an observation center offering controlled wildlife viewing. Maya stood up, raising her hand with such authority that Victoria reluctantly acknowledged her. "Maya Santiago, new resident on Blue Heron Drive," she said clearly. "I have 2 questions. First, why does the HOA marketing material promise pristine wilderness when you're planning to replace it with what looks like a Miami Beach club? And second, has the board informed residents that the lake itself isn't actually HOA property? The room erupted in confused murmurs. Victoria's face flushed with anger. Miss Santiago, property boundaries are not up for debate at this meeting. The lake and all surrounding amenities are part of Evergreen Estates. Maya smiled calmly. Actually, I've reviewed the original deeds and land transfers. The lake and the parcel currently used as the main parking lot were never sold to developers. They remain the private property of the Foster family. She nodded toward me. Mr. Foster has graciously allowed residents to use his property for years, but given recent events, he's reconsidering that arrangement. Victoria slammed her hand on the podium. This is preposterous. We have surveys clearly showing. At that moment, Walter Reed entered the room, commanding attention without saying a word. His reputation as a former judge still carried weight, and the residents fell silent. I can confirm Ms. Santiago's statement, he said, his voice grave. James Foster maintained ownership of the lake and the parking lot through a conservation easement. The 30-year usage agreement expires in 90 days, at which point Mr. Foster can restrict access as he sees fit. The room exploded into chaotic discussion. Someone shouted, "You mean we've been parking on private property?" Another asked, "Can he really keep us off the lake?" Maxwell, ever opportunistic, was filming the entire meltdown for his social media, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure how to spin this disaster. Victoria attempted to regain control, her voice shrill. "This meeting is adjourned. The board will investigate these claims and provide an update." As residents filed out, many glanced at me with newfound curiosity or concern. An older woman named Dorothy Wilson, introduced earlier as the HOA secretary, lingered behind, apparently conflicted. She approached hesitantly. "Mr. Foster? I've been keeping the HOA records for 10 years, she said quietly. "There's something you should know. Victoria has been working with developers on plans much bigger than what was presented tonight. They want to build a luxury resort, and your cabin sits on what they've designated as the main hotel site." Dorothy's revelation didn't surprise me, but her next statement did. "I've been uncomfortable with how things are being handled. The board never properly verified property boundaries before beginning construction." She glanced around nervously. "I've kept copies of all correspondence. If you need them, well, just ask." She hurried away before I could respond. Maya looked impressed. "Seems like you've got an insider now. The HOA might not be as unified as Victoria wants everyone to believe." As we left the clubhouse, several residents nodded to me, a small but significant shift from the suspicious glances I'd received upon arrival. Walter suggested we meet at his house to regroup, away from potentially prying eyes. "Victoria isn't going to back down," he warned. "She's got too much invested in this resort plan. Expect escalation." He wasn't wrong. When I returned to my cabin that night, I found the electricity cut off, an emergency safety measure according to the notice left on my door. The access road was now blocked by construction equipment for maintenance, effectively trapping me on the property. Most alarmingly, the wildlife cameras we'd placed had been removed, and one of the remaining phoenix nests appeared disturbed. "They're trying to force you out," Maya said when I called her. "And they're trying to eliminate evidence of the birds before we can get official protection status." That night, working by lantern light, I reviewed my grandfather's journals more carefully. His detailed observations of the phoenix birds spanned decades, and I began to understand why he'd kept their existence secret. These weren't just rare birds. They were thought to be extinct in the wild until he discovered this small population. Their presence at Osprey Lake wasn't accidental. The unique ecosystem created by the lake's unusual depth and surrounding vegetation created the perfect microclimate for them. My grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting them, and now that responsibility had passed to me. I was no longer just fighting for a family cabin. I was continuing a legacy of conservation that stretched back half a century. At dawn, Maya arrived with coffee, a portable generator, and news. "The county records office confirms everything. You own the lake and parking lot. I've filed emergency protected species paperwork based on your grandfather's documentation and our recent sightings." She hesitated, but Victoria's moving faster than we expected. She scheduled a media event at the lake today, some kind of fundraiser for environmental education that's really just a thinly veiled investor pitch for the resort. Her expression turned grave. "Liam, they're going to announce plans to demolish your cabin as part of the presentation. We need to stop them now." Victoria's environmental fundraiser was a spectacle of hypocrisy. White tents dotted the shore of my lake, while caterers in crisp uniforms served champagne to guests who had arrived in a parade of luxury vehicles, now filling my parking lot. Large banners proclaimed, "The future of Osprey Lake, where luxury meets nature," alongside artistic renderings of a massive resort complex that bore no resemblance to the natural landscape it would replace. Maxwell worked the crowd with his ever-present phone, directing guests to pose in front of a large model of the proposed development, complete with a miniature version of my cabin with a red X through it. Maya, Walter, and I watched from a distance, finalizing our approach. "Remember," Walter cautioned, "Victoria has political connections. We need to be strategic." Maya nodded, checking her phone for confirmation that our legal filings had been properly recorded. "The protected species designation has been submitted, but it will take time for official approval. We need to stall them." I clutched the folder containing my grandfather's original deeds and the notice of property rights we'd prepared. "Let's remind them whose land they're standing on," I said, more calmly than I felt. We waited until Victoria took the stage, tapping a champagne glass for attention. "Welcome, friends and future residents of Osprey Lake Resort," she began, her voice carrying across the water. "For too long, this pristine location has been underutilized, its beauty accessible to only a few. Today, we unveil our vision to transform Osprey Lake into Montana's premier luxury destination, while preserving its natural charm." The crowd applauded politely as she gestured to the architectural renderings. "Construction begins next month, starting with shoreline preparation and removal of outdated structures." A slide appeared showing my cabin, and Victoria's voice took on a rehearsed solemnity, including, unfortunately, this environmental hazard: an unregulated research station operating without permits or oversight. That was our cue. Walter led the way, his formal judge's presence parting the crowd as we approached the stage. Victoria faltered mid-sentence, clearly not expecting interruption. I stepped forward, raising my voice to address the gathering. "Good afternoon. I'm Liam Foster, owner of the environmental hazard Mrs. Harrington just mentioned, and also, as it happens, the legal owner of this lake and the land you're all currently standing on." A murmur ran through the crowd. I held up the property deeds and survey maps. "My grandfather, Dr. James Foster, maintained ownership of the lake and surrounding parcels through a conservation easement established in 1982. The HOA has been permitted to use the parking area through a 30-year agreement that expires in exactly 87 days. Victoria's face contorted with fury. "This is absurd! Security, remove these people!" Two men in blazers moved uncertainly toward us, but Walter stepped forward. "I wouldn't advise that," he said firmly. "As former district judge, I can confirm the legitimacy of these documents. Forcibly removing the legal property owner could constitute criminal trespass and assault." The security guards hesitated, looking to Victoria for guidance. Maxwell, ever the opportunist, had turned his camera on us, clearly seeing potential content in the confrontation. Victoria attempted to regain control, her voice strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't be alarmed by this disruption. These claims are baseless and will be addressed through proper channels." Maya stepped forward next, her professional demeanor commanding attention. "While property rights are being sorted out, there's another matter of immediate concern." She distributed copies of a document to several guests. "This is an application for emergency protected habitat designation under the Endangered Species Act. Osprey Lake is home to a breeding population of mountain phoenix birds, previously thought extinct in the wild." She gestured to the shoreline where construction had already begun. "The habitat destruction currently underway violates federal law and carries potential criminal penalties." As if on cue, a phoenix bird soared overhead, its distinctive copper plumage catching the sunlight. Gasps and pointing followed its flight. Richard Clark, the landscape architect who had so enthusiastically presented the beach renovation at the HOA meeting, broke away from the crowd to examine Maya's documentation. His professional interest appeared genuine. "These surveys are extensive," he remarked, flipping through my grandfather's research. "If accurate, this ecosystem is incredibly significant." Victoria marched over, attempting to snatch the papers from his hands. "Richard, don't engage with this nonsense," but Clark stepped back, his expression troubled. "Victoria, if these birds are present, we need proper environmental impact studies before proceeding. My firm can't be associated with destruction of endangered habitat." The event was unraveling. Investors whispered among themselves, some already making discreet exits. Victoria, desperate to salvage the situation, grabbed the microphone again. "This is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly. Mr. Foster has been operating an illegal wildlife sanctuary and making false claims to obstruct community improvements. She gestured dramatically toward my cabin. That eyesore violates numerous safety codes and environmental regulations. In fact, we've already obtained demolition permits based on county inspections. This was news to me and apparently to Walter as well, who frowned deeply. As Victoria continued her damage control, Dorothy Wilson approached us quietly, handing me a folder. "The demolition permit," she whispered. "Look at the signature on the inspection form. The document authorized demolition based on an environmental inspection supposedly conducted by the county, but the authorizing signature wasn't from any official I recognize." Maya examined it closely, then showed it to Walter, whose eyebrows shot up. "That's not a county inspector's signature," he murmured. "That's Maxwell Harrington's handwriting on a forged document." The pieces clicked into place. Victoria and Maxwell hadn't just been aggressive, they'd been breaking the law, fabricating official documents to fast-track their development plans. The fundraiser ended abruptly when a county sheriff's deputy arrived, responding to Walter's call about potentially forged documents. Victoria and Maxwell retreated to their house across the lake, but the damage was done. Investors departed quickly, distancing themselves from what suddenly looked like a legally questionable venture. Richard Clark approached me before leaving, his expression serious. For what it's worth, I had no idea about the birds or the property issues. I was told this was all properly permitted. He handed me his card. "I specialize in ecological restoration. When the dust settles, perhaps we could discuss how to repair the shoreline damage properly." That evening, as the tents were dismantled and the last cars left my parking lot, Maya, Walter, and I gathered on my cabin porch to assess our victory. "It's not over," Walter cautioned. "Victoria's backed into a corner now, which makes her dangerous." Maya nodded in agreement. "We need to file for a permanent injunction against any development near the nesting sites, and we should formally notify all residents about the property boundaries and upcoming changes to lake access." I watched the sunset reflecting off the water, thinking about my grandfather and the legacy he'd left me. Not just land and birds, but a responsibility to protect something rare and valuable. "You know," I said slowly, "I never planned to restrict access to the lake. I just wanted to prevent it from being destroyed." Walter smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Your grandfather felt the same way. He didn't mind people enjoying the lake, he just didn't want them to fundamentally change it." As darkness fell, we were startled by the distant sound of machinery. Through binoculars, I could make out figures moving at the far shore, and the unmistakable shape of a tanker truck near the water's edge. "What the hell are they doing now?" Maya wondered aloud, reaching for her phone to document the activity. None of us realized then just how desperate Victoria had become, or how far she was willing to go to salvage her plan. The pre-dawn light revealed an ecological disaster unfolding at the lake. An oily sheen spread across the water near the shoreline development site, and the acidic smell of chemicals hung in the air. Dead fish had begun washing up, their silver bodies lining the shore like macabre decorations. Most alarmingly, the remaining phoenix nests showed signs of abandonment, the birds driven away by the contamination. My heart sank as I documented the devastation with photographs and water samples. This wasn't just vandalism, it was ecocide, a deliberate attack on the habitat I was trying to protect. Maya arrived with coffee and grim determination, already on the phone with environmental authorities. "We need hazmat teams here immediately," she insisted. "This is a criminal contamination of a waterway." Walter followed shortly after, his face ashen as he surveyed the damage. "I know Victoria was desperate, but this," he shook his head in disbelief, "this goes beyond trying to drive you out. This is vindictive destruction." While Maya coordinated with authorities, Walter and I attempted to set up makeshift barriers to prevent the contamination from spreading further into the lake. By mid-morning, county environmental officials had arrived, along with a local news crew alerted by Walter's contacts. The reporter, a sharp-aimed woman named Rachel Martinez, interviewed me on camera about the ongoing dispute with the HOA and the protected birds. "So to clarify," she said, "you own this lake, there's an endangered species nesting here, and somehow hazardous chemicals were dumped overnight after you challenged development plans?" I nodded grimly. "That about sums it up." Rachel turned to the camera. "We've reached out to Evergreen Estates HOA President Victoria Harrington for comment but have received no response. County officials confirm the chemical dumping appears deliberate and potentially criminal. Environmental teams are working to contain the damage." The story spread quickly. By afternoon, curious residents had gathered at the shoreline, watching the cleanup efforts and murmuring among themselves. Richard Clark arrived with several colleagues, offering professional assistance with containment strategies. "This goes against everything I stand for as a landscape architect," he said angrily. "I design with nature, not against it." Dorothy Wilson appeared as well, clutching a thick file folder and looking nervous. "I have something you should see," she told me quietly. HOA meeting minutes and emails about the resort development. Victoria specifically discussed removing obstacles, including your cabin and any environmental protections. As the cleanup continued, Maya pulled me aside, her expression serious. "The water samples show industrial solvents and petroleum products, not something you just happen to have lying around. This was planned." She lowered her voice further. "The sheriff wants to interview Victoria and Maxwell, but they're not responding to calls. Their house appears empty." The implications were chilling. Had they fled to avoid consequences, or were they planning something else? We didn't have to wait long for an answer. A resident hurried over, phone in hand. "You need to see this," he said urgently. Maxwell had posted a video online, filmed from what appeared to be a moving vehicle. In it, Victoria tearfully claimed they were being driven from their home by eco-terrorists who had fabricated environmental concerns to devalue property and take control of the community. She accused me of deliberately contaminating the lake myself to prevent development and framed them. The video ended with a call for support from their followers and a promise to fight back against radical environmentalists. The narrative was so twisted, so completely backward, that for a moment I could only stare in stunned silence. "They're trying to get ahead of the story," Maya observed grimly, painting themselves as victims before they're officially named as suspects. Walter made a call to his contacts at the sheriff's department. "They've put out an alert for the Harringtons' vehicle," he reported, "and they've obtained a warrant to search their home based on evidence from the chemical supplier. Apparently Maxwell used his own credit card to purchase the contaminants, not exactly criminal mastermind material." Despite the seriousness of the situation, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. Victoria and Maxwell had been so convinced of their righteousness, so accustomed to getting their way, that they hadn't even bothered to cover their tracks effectively. As evening approached, environmental teams had contained the worst of the spill, though the full ecological impact would take time to assess. Maya and I walked the shoreline, documenting damage and searching for any signs of returning wildlife. "The phoenix birds are gone," I said heavily. "My grandfather protected them for decades and I lost them in a matter of days." Maya touched my arm gently. "They might return if we can restore the habitat. Birds are resilient." She pointed to a distant tree line. "And look, there's still one pair nesting on the far side of the lake, away from the contamination. We haven't lost everything." The unexpected sound of heavy rain interrupted our conversation, except the sky was clear. Turning toward the noise, we witnessed a surreal sight. The HOA's sprinkler system had activated across all lakefront properties simultaneously, creating a bizarre artificial downpour. "That's not supposed to happen," Maya said, frowning. "The system is on a staggered schedule to avoid overloading the water pressure." We watched in confusion as the sprinklers continued to run beyond their normal cycle, water pooling on the manicured lawns and beginning to flow downhill toward the lake. A horrible realization dawned on me. "The contamination," I said urgently. "It wasn't just the chemicals they dumped directly in the water. They've put something in the HOA irrigation system." We raced to the central control box, finding it damaged and locked in the on position. "They're trying to wash more contaminants into the lake through the runoff," Maya realized, already dialing emergency services. Within minutes, Walter had rallied residents to shut off water mains to their individual properties, while county workers rushed to disconnect the main irrigation system. The sabotage was sophisticated enough to suggest planning, but executed hastily, another sign of Victoria and Maxwell's desperate final attack before fleeing. As darkness fell, the immediate crisis had been contained, though the lake had suffered additional contamination. Exhausted residents gathered at the clubhouse, where an emergency meeting was convened. Without Victoria's controlling presence, people spoke freely about their concerns and frustrations. Many expressed shock at the environmental vandalism committed in their community's name. Richard Clark stepped up, offering his firm's services pro bono to help restore damaged habitat. "This isn't who we are," he insisted. "We chose Osprey Lake for its natural beauty, not to destroy it." Amid the discussions, a sheriff's deputy arrived with news. Victoria and Maxwell Harrington had been apprehended at the Canadian border, attempting to leave the country with suitcases full of cash and documents. Among the items recovered was a laptop containing detailed plans for what they'd called Operation Phoenix Removal. a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of the protected birds and drive me from my property. The deliberate contamination of the lake had been their desperate final move after the failed investor event. The revelation stunned the community into silence. Then Dorothy Wilson stood up, her voice quavering but determined. I move to immediately remove Victoria from the HOA board and begin the process of electing new leadership. The motion passed unanimously. As the meeting concluded, residents approached me one by one, some apologizing for believing Victoria's characterization of me, others offering help with lake cleanup, still others expressing interest in learning more about the phoenix birds and how to protect them. The community that had seemed so hostile just days earlier was transforming before my eyes. In the midst of environmental disaster, a different kind of ecosystem was emerging, one based on cooperation rather than conflict. Back at my cabin, Maya, Walter, and I sat on the porch, too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion. Your grandfather would be proud, Walter said quietly, not just because you fought for the land, but because you're bringing people together around it. I wasn't so sure. The lake was damaged, the birds mostly gone, and the future uncertain. Yet as we talked, I realized something important. My grandfather hadn't just left me property, he'd left me purpose. His journals weren't just scientific records, they were a roadmap for stewardship, for balancing human presence with natural preservation. Tomorrow we start the real work, I said, watching the moonlight ripple across the contaminated water, healing the lake. 1 month after what local papers dubbed the Osprey Lake eco-crime, the landscape had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The physical cleanup was well underway, with environmental teams removing contaminated soil and treating affected water. More profoundly, the community itself had transformed. The new HOA board, led by Richard Clark with Dorothy Wilson continuing as secretary, had unanimously approved a comprehensive ecological restoration plan. Residents volunteered weekends for cleanup efforts, and several had become amateur bird watchers, eagerly reporting phoenix sightings to our newly established monitoring program. Victoria and Maxwell Harrington faced multiple felony charges, including environmental crimes, forgery of official documents, and fraud. Their social media empire had imploded when followers learned the truth about their luxury lifestyle built on destruction and deceit. According to Walter's courthouse contacts, they were negotiating plea deals that would include substantial restitution payments toward lake restoration. The investment group behind their resort plans had publicly withdrawn all support and issued a statement distancing themselves from the unauthorized and illegal actions of the Harringtons. Meanwhile, I had decisions to make about the future of the property. With the 30-year usage agreement expiring, I had legal authority to restrict access to both the lake and the parking lot, but that no longer felt like the right approach. Maya had helped me research conservation easements and land trusts that could protect the environmental integrity of the lake while still allowing controlled public access. Your grandfather found a balance, she reminded me. He didn't close the lake off completely, he just set boundaries to protect what mattered most. Walter had been sorting through more of my grandfather's papers and made a remarkable discovery. James had a long-term vision, he explained, spreading decades-old documents across my kitchen table. He established a trust with specific instructions. If the lake ever faced serious environmental threat and was subsequently saved, ownership would transfer to a community conservation trust. Walter smiled at my surprise. He believed that once people fought to save something, they would be invested in protecting it for the long term. The documents included detailed plans for a sustainable management structure involving both environmental experts and community representatives, as if my grandfather had somehow foreseen exactly this situation. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Richard Clark stood on the porch, excitement evident in his expression. "You need to see this," he said, leading us down to the shoreline. There, in the early morning light, a pair of phoenix birds was constructing a new nest in the recovered section of shoreline. Their copper feathers glinted as they worked methodically, seemingly undeterred by our presence. "They're coming back," Richard said softly. "The restoration is working." The sight filled me with a profound sense of rightness. My grandfather's legacy continuing, the birds reclaiming their home. That afternoon, I attended an HOA meeting held in the rehabilitated shoreline area rather than the formal clubhouse. Residents sat on blankets and folding chairs as Richard presented the finalized research plan. "We've incorporated Liam's grandfather's research to recreate authentic habitat, not just cosmetic improvements," he explained. and we've redesigned the community's water management system to protect the lake from runoff contamination. When Richard finished, all eyes turned to me expectantly. I took a deep breath and stood. As many of you know, I own this lake and the land you're currently using as a parking lot, I began. The usage agreement expires in a few weeks. I've been considering the best path forward, and I've made a decision. I explained the community trust my grandfather had established and my intention to activate it. This means the lake will belong to all of us collectively, with legal protections ensuring it remains environmentally sound. In return, I'm asking for 3 commitments. First, that a portion of HOA dues go toward ongoing conservation. Second, that development around the lake follows sustainable guidelines. And third, that my cabin remain as a research station and educational center. The proposal was met with enthusiastic approval. Dorothy suggested forming a joint management committee with both HOA members and environmental experts. Maya, who had become a respected voice in the community, offered legal assistance in structuring the arrangement. Even residents who had initially been cool toward me approached with suggestions and offers of support. The transformation was remarkable. From hostility to collaboration in the span of a month, united by a shared love for the place we all called home. As the meeting concluded, a resident named Michael asked about the phoenix birds. Are they really as rare as they say? Will they stay? I explained what my grandfather had discovered decades ago, that Osprey Lake's unique conditions created a microclimate perfectly suited to the birds' needs. With proper protection, they'll not only stay but thrive, I said. And we can help other communities establish similar conservation models. The enthusiasm was palpable. Already, residents were discussing educational programs, citizen science initiatives, and wildlife photography guidelines that would balance appreciation with protection. Later that evening, as the sun set over the recovering lake, I sat on my grandfather's, now my dock, with Maya and Walter. The cabin behind us was undergoing its own transformation, with careful upgrades to its research facilities while preserving its rustic character. Your grandfather was a chess player, not a checkers player, Walter observed, sipping his whiskey. He saw the whole board, many moves ahead. Maya nodded in agreement. He knew saving the lake would require more than one person. It would take a community. I watched a phoenix bird soar across the golden surface of the water, its reflection rippling beneath it like fire. He left me more than property, I said. He left me a mission, and now it's become a shared one. In the months that followed, Osprey Lake became something of a model for environmental restoration and community management. The phoenix birds returned in greater numbers, establishing new nests around the protected shoreline. My cabin evolved into a research and education center, hosting school groups and university researchers studying the unique ecosystem. The HOA, once a vehicle for exclusion and control under Victoria's leadership, transformed into a collaborative body focused on balancing human enjoyment with environmental stewardship. Maya and I grew closer through our shared work and eventually moved in together, combining her legal expertise and my biological knowledge to develop conservation frameworks for other communities. Richard Clark's landscaping firm specialized in ecological restoration, with Osprey Lake as its flagship success story. Even Dorothy Wilson found a new purpose, documenting the lake's history and transformation for future generations. As for Victoria and Maxwell Harrington, their legal troubles continued, their former mansion now converted into the community's environmental education center, a fitting transformation from symbol of excess to source of knowledge. Sometimes, standing on the shore watching phoenix birds teach their fledglings to fish in the clear waters, I think about what my grandfather wrote in his final journal entry, which Walter found among his papers. Sometimes, to protect what you love, you need more than just ownership of the land beneath your feet. You need to win the hearts of those around you. I've always known this, and someday Liam will understand the true meaning of the legacy. Sitting on the dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in copper and gold, the same colors as the phoenix birds soaring overhead, I finally understand what he meant. True ownership isn't about property lines or legal documents. It's about creating a community of stewards who will protect what matters long after we're gone.